Have you ever wished you had a shortcut? To understanding one of the most, mysterious and often misunderstood books in the Bible.
Hmm.
I'm talking about the book of Revelation. It's dense, it's packed with symbolism, and let's be honest, it can feel incredibly overwhelming to unpack on your own.
It really can.
Yeah.
Very intimidating for many people.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into Revelation. Specifically, we're exploring a fascinating challenge to a long dominant interpretation known as Amillennialism. Our goal isn't really to promote one theological view over another, but more to explore an alternative framework, for understanding this incredible text.
That's right. Our sources, particularly a compelling presentation from True Christian Press, argue that many of the difficulties people face with Revelation.
Ready for some genuine moments that might just change how you see this book forever.
Hopefully.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea. The source argues Revelation's prologue isn't just some flowery introduction. It actually sets crucial boundaries for how we should read the entire book. Almost like a divinely inspired instruction manual.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And what's truly fascinating here is how the book frames itself with these urgent time statements, both at the beginning and the end.
Right, must shortly come to pass.
Exactly, and the time is at hand. These aren't just poetic flourishes,
Yeah.
according to this view. Our source highlights that amillennialism, just to remind listeners, that's the theological perspective, viewing the thousand-year reign as symbolic, happening now spiritually, not literally in the future.
Right.
Amillennialism often interprets these time statements as, flexible or symbolic. But what if we take them literally?
So what does this all mean if we do take those urgent time statements literally? A radically different picture starts to emerge, doesn't it?
It really does.
One that links the visions directly to specific historical events. We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and then the final dissolution of Hebrew national aspirations by 136 CE. It grounds the prophecy in a very specific historical window.
Exactly. It anchors it. And this raises an important question. What happens if we don't take these temporal constraints literally, if we spiritualize them away?
What's the consequence?
Well, our source contends that it actually leads to a systematic misreading of major symbols. Things like the beasts, the harlot, the plagues, the judgments, all those iconic images. This alternative view argues that these dramatic images find remarkable, even precise fulfillment in the historical events of 66 to 136 CE, rather than being abstract prophecies for some far-off future.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. And it's a bold claim, definitely challenges centuries of interpretation.
Is bold.
The presentation argues that amillennialism often misses the primary target of John's visions, focusing on Rome as the central antagonist.
Right.
But according to the source, Jerusalem is truly at the core of Revelation's prophetic narrative.
Yeah, and we connect this to the bigger picture. The source uses that rich Old Testament prophetic imagery, really digging into it, to demonstrate that Jerusalem, not Rome, is the true focus of covenant judgment.
So the great harlot city.
Yes, often identified by amillennialists as Rome, is, for this interpretation, unmistakably Jerusalem. It's a fundamental shift in perspective, a complete reorientation.
That is a significant reorientation. How does the source build such a strong case for Jerusalem? What specific scriptural details make sense only when applied to Jerusalem? And, what's the core insight we should take away?
Well, the source points to powerful charges like killing the prophets, which directly echoes Jesus' indictment of Jerusalem in Matthew 23.
Okay.
It also highlights the very specific context of temple commerce and that pervasive Old Testament covenant language of Israel's marital unfaithfulness. You see it all through Ezekiel 16, Jeremiah 3.
Right, the unfaithful wife metaphor.
Exactly. And Rome, despite its awful persecutions, could never really be charged with all the righteous bloodshed on earth. That's an impossible charge for Rome. Jerusalem, conversely, was consistently depicted as God's unfaithful wife, consistently rejecting the prophets he sent.
So the core insight.
The core insight here, really, is that Revelation, far from being some vague prophecy about a distant empire, becomes this razor-sharp indictment of Jerusalem's historical rejection of its Messiah. And that makes it incredibly relevant, urgently relevant to its original first-century audience.
And when we restore that prologue's temporal framework, those details really do snap into powerful focus, don't they?
They absolutely do.
The text transforms into a crucial, immediate warning to first-century believers about specific judgments building toward a crisis, like the growing tension between the Jerusalem religious establishment and the early church.
And the urgency of shortly come to pass and time is at hand
Yeah.
is just critical to this understanding.
Yeah.
When you see similar time markers in other New Testament writings, say in Romans or James or Peter, they consistently indicate genuine immediacy, something happening very soon. Yet, as our source notes, amillennialism often seems to, well, divorce these statements from their natural urgent meaning when they appear in Revelation.
This pattern becomes quite problematic, doesn't it? Especially when you look at the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3.
Very.
Those references to those who say they are Jews and are not, I mean, that seems to point directly to specific historical tensions, persecution between the early church and the Jerusalem religious establishment.
Exactly. It aligns perfectly with events like Stephen's martyrdom, right there in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
And then consider the martyrs under the altar crying, "How long?" They're told to wait a little while longer.
A little while longer, not centuries.
Right. It emphasizes a specific, rapidly approaching judgment, not some far distant one. And that phrase, "those who dwell on the earth," in Jewish apocalyptic literature, that typically refers to the inhabitants of the land of Israel. It really focuses the attention squarely on Jerusalem's coming crisis.
This deep dive also shows us how Revelation treats divine protection during this period. The sealing of the 144,000, the great multitude, it reveals God's sovereign care.
It does. And the source draws a striking parallel with Ezekiel chapter 9. Remember where the faithful believers were marked, divinely marked for protection before Jerusalem's first destruction.
Ah, okay, so there's a precedent.
A clear precedent. It's a consistent pattern of God protecting his faithful remnant.
And historically, you mentioned this. We know Jewish Christians did heed these warnings.
Yes, absolutely. They fled Jerusalem before its catastrophic fall in 70 CE. They found refuge in a place called Pella, east of the Jordan.
And this wasn't just abstract comfort, was it?
Not at all. It was concrete assurance. It directly connected to Jesus' own specific instructions in the Gospels about fleeing Jerusalem when certain prophetic signs appeared. This historical act of faith, their actual flight, it truly brings the text to life, makes it immediate.
Okay, with this historical lens now firmly in place, let's re-examine some of Revelation's most iconic and often perplexing visions. I suspect you might be surprised how their meaning shifts when we apply this framework.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's start with the wormwood vision in Revelation 8. According to the source, this is a powerful example of how the focus on Jerusalem gets missed.
Right. Traditional interpretations might see wormwood as, a general judgment or maybe even an ecological disaster, something broad. However, our source points out this profound, very specific connection to the Torah's adultery test. Numbers chapter 5.
The bitter waters?
Exactly, where an unfaithful wife drank bitter waters. This imagery powerfully reinforces Jerusalem as God's unfaithful wife, making wormwood a precise indictment against that city, not some general calamity.
That really does deepen the great harlot imagery we'll get to later on. Okay, so what about the enigmatic visions of Revelation 9 and 10, the terrifying locusts and armies?
Yeah, those are tricky ones. Without Jerusalem as the central focus, these visions often appear cryptic, almost disconnected from anything real. The force argues the fifth trumpet's locusts are supernatural entities, not human forces, which is key.
Why is that key?
Because historical records, like from Josephus, show that Israelites living beyond the Euphrates River did not participate in the Jewish revolt. So these couldn't be human armies from that region invading.
Ah, okay. That rules out a common interpretation.
It does. And the sixth trumpet's army, described with these impossible numbers, 200 million, and supernatural powers, also coming from the east, specifically targets Judea, again, pointing towards Jerusalem.
So then we have something truly mysterious. The 7 thunders in Revelation 10, John is commanded to seal them up. How does that fit into this historical framework?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Sealing them indicates their postponement. Their judgment is held back until the ultimate final end of God's judgment against the Old Testament people as a national entity.
Okay.
And the command for John to prophesy again, right there in Revelation 10:11, takes on profound historical significance. Remember, John's later exile to Patmos was in the 90s CE.
Right, well, after 70 CE.
Exactly. So it means he continued to proclaim an unpopular message even after Jerusalem's destruction. The very worst was actually yet to come for the Jewish nation.
Wow. Okay, this leads to an important point about bridging two catastrophes that might seem separate. 70 CE, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then 132, 136 CE, the Bar Kokhba rebellion.
Precisely. Critics often use the fact that John lived beyond 70 CE to try and dismiss Revelation's connection to Jerusalem's destruction.
Right. How could he be writing about 70 CE if he was exiled later?
Exactly. But the source argues this actually shows the extraordinary span of John's prophetic ministry. The events of 70 CE, devastating as they were, didn't end Jewish national aspirations. We saw the diaspora revolts from 115 to 117 CE, and especially the massive Bar Kokhba rebellion from 132 to 136 CE. These were huge attempts to restore Jewish sovereignty.
So the sealing of the seven thunders.
Represents this final, devastating judgment associated with Bar Kokhba that ultimately erased Hebrew national existence as it had been known.
The source also provides incredibly precise dates that, when you line them up, seem to make the idea of recapitulation impossible. Now, just for our listeners, recapitulation is...
Right. It's the idea that the judgment sequences in Revelation, the seals, trumpets, and bowls, aren't sequential events, but are simply different ways of describing the same period of judgment. Retellings.
Okay. So how do the dates challenge that?
Well, think about just a few key moments. The source suggests, for example, May 19, 62 CE, when armies were reportedly seen flying over Judea, interpreted as the initial seal judgments.
Okay.
Then, years later, April 14, 70 CE, Titus begins his devastating stone bombardment of Jerusalem, linked here to the seventh bowl, a completely different kind of event.
Years later.
Yes, and finally, almost 60 years after that, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, concluding around August 5, 135 CE, signifying the fulfillment of those sealed seven thunders. These are distinct events, separated by years, sometimes decades. It makes it very difficult to argue they're just retellings of the same judgment sequence.
Yeah, it's hard to argue that events separated by decades are the same event. The source argues this timeline really exposes the error, even in some other interpretations that try to collapse the events of 135 CE back into 70 CE.
And it raises another important question. If the sequences truly were recapitulating the same events, shouldn't their basic imagery and effects correspond more closely?
You'd think so.
But the source highlights the vastly different categories of judgment. The seals involve military and civil conflicts. The trumpets describe cosmic and ecological catastrophes. They aren't just mirror images.
And the logical problem with the seven thunders further undermines recapitulation, doesn't it? John is explicitly commanded not to write down what the thunders said.
That's a really powerful point. If all the sequences were identical representations of the same events, then sealing the thunders would effectively mean sealing all the sequences.
Which makes no sense if he wrote down the seals, trumpets, and bowls.
Exactly. It would be like telling someone not to reveal a secret, while then publishing it in 3 or 4 different forms. The command to seal proves they are distinct phases, each with its own specific purpose and timing, showing God's sovereign control over how and when judgment unfolds. Now, another strong challenge to the standard amillennial interpretation comes in Revelation 11, the measuring of the second temple.
Right.
John described a physically standing temple, one that could be measured, with its outer court being trampled for 42 months.
The temple was destroyed by 70 CE. This creates an immediate problem for any interpretations that date Revelation later than that, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's a huge chronological marker. And that 42-month time frame, it aligns perfectly with the period of Jerusalem's crisis, starting around January 31st, 67 CE, when the Zealot factions seized control of the temple area.
Okay.
Amillennialism typically has to spiritualize this temple, make it symbolic of the church or something else. But the source argues John's original audience would have immediately recognized the concrete, tangible reality of their temple, the one standing right there.
And the two witnesses in that same chapter, they're clearly placed in the great city where their Lord was crucified.
Unmistakably Jerusalem.
There's really no room for debate there, is there?
Well, not plausibly, no. Applying the great city to Rome or some abstract world system requires ignoring that explicit statement about Christ's crucifixion, a reading that would have been completely foreign, even nonsensical, to the original audience. And the details, like the earthquake and the 7,000 killed, they align remarkably well with contemporary accounts, like from Josephus, describing Jerusalem's destruction.
Okay, let's talk about the woman pursued by the dragon in Revelation 12. Amillennialism often sees this as, the church throughout all of history, this general struggle against evil.
Right, a broad symbolic picture. But the source argues the specific details align directly and pointedly with the Jerusalem church's flight to Pella just before 70 CE.
How so?
Well, the woman, clothed with the sun, moon, and 12 stars, that echoes Joseph's dream back in Genesis 37, it represents the covenant people, Israel. Her male child, caught up to God, clearly identifies with the Son of Man figure, Christ. And importantly, the time frame given, 12,060 days for her wilderness sojourn, corresponds exactly to the temple's desecration period mentioned back in chapter 11.
Not thousands of years.
Not thousands of years. It's the specific, limited period tied to the events surrounding 70 CE.
And this is historically fulfilled. You mentioned Eusebius.
Yes, Eusebius, the early church historian, documented the Jerusalem church's escape to Pella before the city's destruction, exactly as Jesus had warned them to do when they saw certain signs.
Wow.
It's a powerful demonstration of God's faithful protection of his specific people during Jerusalem's final crisis. It reinforces that Revelation spoke directly to highly relevant life and death events for its original readers.
Then there's the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, often identified as a symbol of Rome, the Roman Empire.
It's a default interpretation for many.
But the source makes a compelling case for the Zealot occupation of Jerusalem, starting January 31st, 67 CE.
Yes. Think about the beast's activities described in the text. Demanding total allegiance, controlling commerce, persecuting dissenters. That perfectly matches the situation in Jerusalem under Zealot control during the Jewish revolt. Josephus describes it vividly. And the mark of the beast, rather than being tied to the Roman imperial cult, this view aligns it with the Zealot economic controls and the loyalty oaths they demanded. Josephus even documents them mandating a specific wound on the right hand for identification or allegiance.
That's incredibly specific. What about the deadly wound that heals? Another famous detail.
The source connects that to the assassination of Menahem, who's the grandson of Judas of Galilee, a key figure in the early revolutionary movement, and the subsequent resurgence of the Jewish Revolutionary War effort after his death. Again, something documented by Josephus. And the number 666, far from being a general symbol of evil, or even specifically Nero, some futures suggest, likely connected directly to contemporary Jewish revolutionary dynamics and the Zealot government's attempt to establish a counterfeit messianic kingdom right there in Jerusalem. It had immediate context.
So following this logic, the judgment sequences in Revelation 14 and 16, which Amillennialism often universalizes to apply to all of history or the end times, they also find specific targeted fulfillment here.
Absolutely. Look at the proclamation of Babylon's fall in chapter 14. It echoes prophetic declarations made against Jerusalem in the Old Testament, particularly Isaiah's vineyard song.
Okay.
The treading of the winepress outside the city, with blood flowing up to the horses' bridles, hauntingly previews the reality of Jerusalem's brutal siege and the slaughter that occurred. The mark of the beast in this context signifies alignment with the Zealot regime within Jerusalem, and the warning not to accept it aligns perfectly with Jesus' explicit warnings to his followers to flee that movement, not join it.
And Revelation 15 then sets the stage for those final devastating bowl judgments.
Yes, a pivotal passage. It shows the faithful believers victorious despite the intense persecution. They're standing on a sea of glass mingled with fire, singing the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb,
Strip 5.
signifying their ultimate vindication and God's comprehensive justice about to be poured out. And the bowl judgments themselves in chapter 16 then target Jerusalem specifically, vividly echoing the plagues God sent on Egypt. Details like the great city splitting into 3 parts that perfectly describe Jerusalem's internal factions fighting each other during its final days, as Josephus recorded.
Right.
On the 100-pound hailstones, they matched the massive scones hurled by Roman siege engines that bombarded the city walls.
What's truly striking here is how the source argues these prophecies found such precise fulfillment in Jerusalem's destruction, providing such specific details about God's judgment on the city that rejected its Messiah. It reads almost like a, prophetically informed journalistic report of what actually happened.
Yeah, the level of detail is remarkable when viewed through that lens. And the vision of Babylon the Great in Revelation 17 and 18, the source contends this is perhaps the most decisive evidence against the standard amillennial interpretation identifying it as Rome.
Because?
While often identified as Rome, almost every single detail, when examined closely, points unmistakably to Jerusalem.
You mean specific things like being drunk with the blood of the prophets and saints?
Exactly that. It directly echoes Jesus' own powerful indictment of Jerusalem in Matthew 23. Only Jerusalem consistently bears that specific charge throughout the Old Testament prophets. It's her unique condemnation. And the harlot imagery just continues that pervasive metaphor of Jerusalem as God's unfaithful wife. You see it so clearly in Ezekiel 16, Jeremiah 3. Even her adornment, the description of her wealth and clothing, mirrors Ezekiel's description of Jerusalem's original divine endowment.
Okay, but what about the 7 mountains where the woman sits? That's almost always linked to Rome, which famously was built on 7 hills.
True, Rome was. But Jerusalem, too, was known in antiquity as being built on 7 mountains or hills. But perhaps more profoundly, mountains in prophetic literature often represent kingdoms or political powers.
Ah, okay, so it might not be literal geography.
It could be symbolic of the very powers, the factions, maybe even briefly allied nations that temporarily supported Jerusalem's rebellion before ultimately turning against her, fulfilling another aspect of the prophecy. And the merchant's lament in chapter 18, it closely parallels Ezekiel's prophecy about Jerusalem's fall, and their specific mourning over lost temple-related commerce points directly to Jerusalem's unique Second Temple economy, things Rome wouldn't trade in.
And that declaration in Revelation 18.24 that in this city was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth, that directly aligns with Jesus' words about Jerusalem's cumulative guilt.
Applying that to Rome truly strains credibility, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Rome could not possibly be charged with all the righteous bloodshed on earth, including figures like Abel or Zechariah, shed centuries before Rome was even a major power. And the call, "Come out of her, my people," in Revelation 18.4. It aligns perfectly with Jesus' specific warnings to his followers to physically flee Jerusalem before its destruction. This wasn't just a general call to separate from worldliness. It was a literal command that saved many lives when the Jerusalem church actually fled to Pella.
And the finality of the city's judgment, cast down like a millstone, never to be found again. How does that fit Jerusalem versus Rome?
Well, that perfectly matches the totality of Jerusalem's destruction in 70 CE. Unlike Rome, which continued and evolved, historical Jerusalem truly ceased to exist as the city it had been. Its temple was gone, its priesthood destroyed, its national identity shattered. It marked the definitive end of the Old Covenant system centered there.
Okay, now let's turn to Revelation 20. This is a chapter often seen almost universally as describing events at the absolute end of human history. The final judgment, the binding of Satan.
Right, the millennial reign, Gog and Magog,
Yeah.
usually placed in the distant future.
But our source suggests it finds its fulfillment much earlier, in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-136 CE. That's a very different timeline.
It is. And this interpretation is crucial for understanding the chronological placement within this framework. Think about Jesus himself, back in the parable of the unclean spirit in Matthew 12.
Refresh my memory on that one.
He warned that the evil spirit cast out of his generation wouldn't stay gone. It would return with 7 worse spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, he said this would happen within that same generation's lifetime.
Yeah, okay.
This perfectly aligns, the source argues, with a pattern of Jewish rebellion, suppressed in 70 CE, but then erupting again, even worse, culminating in the catastrophic Bar Kokhba uprising 60 years later.
So the final deception gathering the nations for battle, that's not some distant future event, but it played out historically with Bar Kokhba.
That's the argument. During this final revolt, the Jewish nation briefly established an independent state again. They even reportedly built a provisional temple, restored sacrifices for a time, minted coins proclaiming year 1 of the redemption of Israel, and Bar Kokhba himself was hailed as the Messiah.
Even by prominent figures.
Yes, even by Rabbi Akiva, a renowned and highly respected figure at the time. He proclaimed Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. So the text's reference to Gog and Magog, those ancient prophetic symbols often representing the ultimate enemies of God's people being gathered for battle, is applied here to this final, desperate attempt to establish a Jewish kingdom by force in opposition to Christ's true reign.
And the catastrophic end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian's absolute destruction of Jerusalem, rebuilding it as a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, and banning Jews from even entering, that fulfills this prophecy. It's truly the final curtain on that era.
That's how this interpretation reads it. It resolves many difficulties found in other views by presenting a coherent, historically grounded sequence of events falling within the time frame Jesus himself seemed to specify for the judgment on that generation. It describes not the end of human history itself, but the definitive end of the Old Covenant world order, marking Christ's absolute triumph over the national Jewish system that had rejected him.
Wow. This deep dive has truly challenged us, I think, to reconsider how we approach Revelation, moving from maybe a broad, often abstract, future-focused view to a very specific, historically anchored first-century context. The presentation fundamentally questions the standard amillennial framework by demonstrating, or attempting to demonstrate, that Revelation 20 isn't some far-off future event, but a crucial part of a specific historical narrative. The story of the final dissolution of Hebrew national aspirations.
And this interpretation reveals Revelation as, essentially, a precise prophetic report, documenting the definitive judgment of the Old Covenant system. But this judgment, as the source is careful to state, wasn't just an end in itself. It was the necessary clearing away of the old to make room for the new covenant reality in Christ. The seals, trumpets, bowls, and thunders were the means to the greatest end, the full establishment of the eternal New Jerusalem.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? How does this shift things?
Well, while the source certainly agrees with our amillennial brothers and sisters on the ultimate reality of eternal life and heavenly hope with God, it profoundly challenges the timing of specific prophetic fulfillments, including resurrection events. This view understands these key transition points to have occurred during the termination of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, specifically within that window of 6770 CE and culminating around 132-136 CE.
So here's a provocative thought for you to mull over, directly from the source material. It states that our future glory, our clothing in the New Jerusalem, doesn't depend on some future general resurrection event yet to happen. Instead, it argues the faithful departed are already gloriously present in that eternal city. It describes the eternal state not primarily as a future event we're waiting for, but as a present reality for those in Christ.
Yeah.
Encompassing that breathtaking vision of Revelation 21 and 22, the New Jerusalem, descending from God out of heaven, adorned as a bride.
Imagine that city. Pure gold, foundations sparkling with precious stones, gates made of single pearls, streets like transparent gold.
Incredible imagery.
And the sheer scale. Described as 1,500 miles in length, width, and height, a perfect cube reflecting the Holy of Holies but infinitely expanded. There, the river of the water of life flows. The tree of life bears fruit continuously, and there's no need for a temple building because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The faithful martyrs we saw back in Revelation 15. According to this view, they already stand in victory there, serving God day and night, with every tear wiped away. This isn't just a metaphor for heaven. It's presented as the literal, magnificent, eternal home of the redeemed, already established, where we shall see his face and reign forever.
So what stands out to you from this deep dive? Perhaps this challenges you to revisit Revelation or maybe other ancient texts with a fresh perspective, to look for those specific historical connections that can bring the text to life in a new way. Consider how often maybe we tend to spiritualize or futurize things that might have been meant as concrete warnings or specific promises for a particular historical moment. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.